What is going on, everybody? And I can't tell you how many videos I have watched on this website of people basically expressing their frustration at the state that Nintendo is in right now. And I've noticed one similarity throughout a lot of these videos that got me to thinking about something. So this isn't verbatim. This is basically just a paraphrase of what a lot of people were saying. So I've noticed that a lot of people were saying that, Nintendo, I remember when you were the king of the gaming industry, when you were on top, you could do no wrong, I loved everything that you did, I wish you would go back to that. I've noticed a lot of people have stated that. So when I hear that, I immediately go back and I actually think about Nintendo in the past, when they were actually at the top of the gaming mountain. And lately, when I've thought about that, a question popped into my head, and I figured that this would be worth sharing to see what you all think. I'm starting to wonder if Nintendo's success was mostly just based on pure luck. Now, when I say that, and I'm being careful by saying this, I'm not saying that it was all luck, but the more I've thought about it, I wonder if most of their success was based on luck, and I will gladly explain why I've thought about that. Now, of course, a lot of you know about the North American video game crash of 1983, when that E.T. game got released on the Atari, I think it was the 2600, and it basically crashed the gaming industry in North America. Actually, not to derail the video here, but it's kind of funny when you think about how a really crappy game pretty much just killed the gaming industry, but today a really crappy game can come out and we just continue on. We just chuck that game to the side and just continue on. So it's kind of funny when you think about it. Think about how strong the gaming industry is today compared to back then. But anyway, back on topic. The NES came out in 1985. And of course, Super Mario Brothers, the Super Mario Brothers Duck Hunt combo, and the NES released and pretty much saved the gaming industry in North America, because the NES was a really great system. But there was one key factor to Nintendo's success around the mid-80s. And a lot of people don't think about this, and I've just recently started thinking about it a lot more. Nintendo had no competition whatsoever when the NES launched. They really didn't. And it wasn't until the Sega Genesis came out in 1989 that Nintendo had actual competition. So think about it. Think about it. For 4 straight years, it was the entire gaming industry was basically Nintendo. If you wanted to play console gaming, or really just, I can't really tell you how strong PC gaming was, but I wouldn't think that it really wasn't that strong back then. But so basically, gaming in general, it was all Nintendo, and Nintendo knew this, and that's how they gained control of pretty much the entire industry back then. And let me put it to you this way for any of you younger gamers that happen to be watching this. Imagine if Sony or Microsoft was the only gaming system you could play video games on for 4 straight years. I know it's kind of hard to believe, but just imagine that. That was pretty much what the gaming industry was back in the mid to late 80s. It was pretty much all Nintendo. Now, I know someone's going to mention that, hey, the Atari was still around and they had the Atari 5200. The Atari 5200 was a pile of crap. It is one of the worst gaming consoles in history. And I seriously mean that. It was that bad. When I say competition, and maybe this is just my definition, when I say competition, I'm talking about an equal leveled playing field. Not, here's a very, very superior console, and here's a very, very crappy console. Because that's not really competition now, is it? That's not really a fair competition. So, I'm sorry, I don't count the Atari 5200. So yeah, Nintendo for 4 straight years had pretty much control of the gaming industry, and that's how they were able to accrue a lot of power back then. So when you launch a console and you have literally no competition whatsoever, it's not really hard to be successful. You have no one competing with you. You pretty much can just almost do no wrong at that point. So it wasn't until the Sega Genesis that Nintendo had strict competition. And I remember a lot of kids back then saw the Sega Genesis and they had NESs and they were jealous of the Sega Genesis 16-bit graphics. And they kind of felt like that they had the old product with the NES. So Nintendo was backed against the wall here. They actually had legit strict competition for once. So what did they do to combat the Sega Genesis? And it's kind of funny considering what they actually did to combat the Genesis when you look at Nintendo today. They had to make a more powerful console that had the most amount of games of different varieties, a better controller than the competition. And that's what they did when they launched the Super Nintendo. So just think about that for a second. In order for Nintendo to compete around that time, they actually had to progress and adapt and make a stronger and better console than the Sega Genesis to compete with it. It's kind of funny when you look at it, when you look at Nintendo today and they don't want to progress. They want to stay in the past. So, it's kind of funny seeing that Nintendo basically had to do what we want Nintendo to do today. They had to do it back then, and they did. But, be that as it may, despite the fact that the Super Nintendo came out and was basically, statistically, a superior console to the Sega Genesis, it didn't really matter that much. Both consoles were neck and neck. Then, as a lot of you probably know, Sega pretty much did themselves in with the 32X, the Sega CD, and then the Sega CD 32X. They pretty much killed themselves. Nintendo didn't have to do a damn thing to cause the demise of Sega. Sega pretty much killed themselves. So, this is how I see it. Wouldn't that constitute as also being lucky as well? Lucky that the competitor pretty much killed themselves? Once again, it's just a thought. And then, in late 1994, the Sony PlayStation launched. And ever since that day, from then till right this very moment, Nintendo has had constant, strict competition. And look at that time period from late 1994 till now. There's something you should notice. Nintendo is not seen as the king of gaming anymore. They are not seen as the top of the mountain. From the Nintendo 64 till now, Nintendo has not been viewed like that. Because they had strict competition. And once again, that's a whole separate matter that I could go on and on about. But look at all that. When Nintendo has had strict competition, they don't seem as the best around. They don't seem like they are the king of the mountain, basically. They're not viewed as that. And the only time they were really viewed as that is when they did not have competition. So I'm starting to wonder if most of their success could be attributed to just being lucky, being at the right place at the right time. Because just imagine, what if the NES launched in 1985 and there was no video game crash? What if there were already strong consoles on the market at that time? And then the NES launched to compete with those consoles. Would the NES have been as successful? I mean, who's to say? It probably still would have. But maybe Nintendo wouldn't have had as big of a monopoly on the gaming industry if that was the case. The gaming industry as we know it right now could be totally different. So, I'm just wondering, could we attribute most of their success based on luck? And maybe they never were technically the company that we view them as back then. Just a thought. And I know people are going to look at this video and they're going to see it as, oh, another hate Nintendo video, another bash video. No. Well, I guess in some way it could be like that, but it's just something I thought about. It just popped in my head when I was thinking about that time period and all the consoles that were launching and Nintendo's past successes. And that's what I've just noticed, that when Nintendo has had strict competition, they don't seem to be as successful. Or at least they don't seem to be perceived as number one when they have strict competition. Because, as we have seen time after time, when they have strict competition, they just can't seem to compete a lot of times. Like, look at today. They can't really compete today in today's gaming. They just can't seem to compete, and they just seemed more focused on doing other stuff than actually competing in the gaming industry. So, who's to say that they would have been as successful if the NES launched when there was already strong consoles on the market? Who knows? It's just something I thought about. So, alright, I think that's about it. Just let me know what you think, and I will see you all later. Have a good 4th of July.